Thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to introduce this panel with John Dankosky, who is the Director of News at Science Friday, as well as Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, who is a marine biologist, policy expert, author, and co-founder of Urban Ocean Labs. Thank you.
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming out. It's kind of a nice day to be inside, so we're going to keep this super exciting for you because we're going to make it worth your while.
I will be as entertaining as possible.
As entertaining as possible. It's so good to see you once again.
Likewise.
So we talked on stage at the Connecticut Forum back in 2019, and at the time we were doing a panel called Climate Crisis. A big report had just come out from the UN that was pretty dire, and we were trying to be hopeful, but frankly, it was a little bit of a downer evening. I just remember there was a lot of stuff that was kind of
not a really cute baby backstage. It's like my primary memory of that.
That was
night.
your memory of the night.
Yeah, and I had to hug Gina McCarthy for the first time.
Gina's kind of the best, isn't she? I know, but how have you been thinking about this differently in the last 5 years? Has your mind changed about how we think about the climate crisis since that time?
Well, I no longer wear high heels to events. I looked back at those pictures the other day and I was like, who was that person?
It was a choice.
Yeah. Red suede, too. I think the way that I think about this, you're kind of asking, this question about hope, right? Like in the face of all this really dire news, all these terrifying scientific projections, sort of like, how do we think about a way forward? And basically that is what I've been thinking about since we last met there, because I wrote an entire book called What If We Get It Right? Visions of Climate Futures, because in essence, because I've been struggling with that answer for myself. And so what I've done is talk to people who have different elements of this answer to try to put the pieces of the puzzle together. But as far as the sort of mindset or approach, I think it's almost like the title of my book is like only half the title. It's like, what if we get it as right as possible? Would be like the real title for the book, which is like less catchy.
Your publisher was like, nah, let's workshop that.
What if we get it like 78% correct?
But this is important, right? I mean, this is a key part of what you write about in the book, and we're not going to get it all right. So what if we do get it partially right?
Wouldn't that be better than getting it all wrong? I mean, we've all gotten a B+ on an exam and like life goes on. But if you fail, you have some awkward dinner table conversations with your parents at the very least, right? So I just want to avoid my angry parents, basically. So could we get it together?
But, okay, so there's a lot of room in the middle between complete failure and complete success. Mm-hmm. So can you walk us through that and what it looks like what a climate future looks like, where we get it partially right? There's still problems, but we get it partially right, and that's okay. We get the B+.
I mean, we'd have high-speed trains in this country, for one, that I could take home tonight after this show. I think a lot about this, like, we have all the solutions we need. It's just a matter of how quickly we're going to implement them, right? Like, we know how to electrify transportation. We know how to insulate buildings. We know how to improve energy efficiency. We know how to protect and restore ecosystems. We know how to build bike lanes. We know how to compost. We know how to reduce food waste. None of these are like secret magical, like we're not going to figure them out until 2100 kinds of things. It's largely a matter of political will, which is dependent on cultural change. Hey, it's Nisi, one of my students from Bowdoin College. So I think that's like the big question mark, right? Is speed. And like it is this like 0 to 100 kind of scale that I think of it on, as opposed to 0 or 100, which is how a lot of the times it's phrased. It's either apocalypse or paradise. And I'm just like, well, it's not going to be paradise. We've already, the greenhouse gases are out of the bag, right? It's not going to be apocalypse. because we actually are doing so many of these things that we're supposed to be doing, right? Like the electrification revolution is happening, thanks in large part to, the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, which does not get nearly enough credit. I love that this audience is thrilled about that because people don't normally clap for the IRA. And so I think that's kind of like what keeps me going is like, how can we just like nudge this a little faster? And my focus right now is I don't do the technical stuff. I'm not out there like figuring out how to make solar panels like 7% more efficient. I'm thinking a lot about the cultural change piece of this to accelerate implementation.
The cultural change piece of it, it shows up throughout your book, and you ask a bunch of what if questions.
The book is not out yet. He got an advance copy. You guys have not missed anything.
It's coming out in September. It's very cool, but you ask a bunch of what if questions, and one of the ones that I love is, what if climate adaptation is beautiful? What made you think of that particular question?
I was collaborating with a bunch of artists for a show I curated at Pioneer Works Arts Institution in Brooklyn last year. And that was it was one of the prompts that I gave them because I was trying to get them to help us envision this transformed world. And I think it comes in part out of being raised by my father, who was an architect and an artist, a potter. And so I learned to see the world through his eyes. Like I would walk through New York City and he would tell me what was beautiful and what was ugly. This building has good shoulders. We like the Chrysler building. This is trash. Like this is going to fall apart in 5 years, right? Take me to the Museum of Modern Art, show me the furniture that's in the museum, which I thought was like an extremely elaborate April Fool's joke because it was like all of our household furniture in the museum because we had like an Ames chair in the 80s that I still have today. So like investing in good stuff is another version of sustainability that he taught me, right? Like buy the nice shoes and then wear them for 10 years. And so a lot of the sort of design approach that I embrace is because of that. But also like, what is the point of doing all this work if the future that we get looks like crap? Like we have we are building the future. Like, why don't we just build it to be pretty? And I think that so much of this regreening of the world and renewable energy. I mean, I think like sheep taking shade under solar panels is like pretty cute. Like we could have like a very cute future, right? But at scale, all of these solutions.
The future is cute is a nice slogan. I read that when I read what if climate adaptation is beautiful, to also it made me think of people coming together to do something being beautiful. Like there's some beauty in that I don't think we give credit for because we think about it as a political movement. We're gonna angrily march in the streets, or we're gonna try to get out the vote. But there's something.
Oh my God! Please get out the vote, you guys. Just to be clear,
I'm not.
This is a climate election.
but just framing it that's kind of activation could be a beautiful thing.
Yeah,
might be activating to some people.
I mean, I think what I hear in your question is that we haven't really welcomed in people that well to the environmental movement, right? Like there are all these other doors that people could enter through. And one of them is design and, art and design and culture. And for any number of reasons, that part of society hasn't effectively engaged with these questions of helping us see a climate future we would actually want. We have a lot of this like terrifying apocalyptic art and film and media, but that's not how I feel about it anyways. That's not terribly motivating. You're like, okay, I don't want that. But what do we want to build is a question we don't really have a lot of visual answers for. Like, what is the modern version even of like the Jetsons, right? And the closest that we've come on a mass culture scale is Black Panther, I think. Through Kendra Pierre-Louis, this incredible climate journalist who's at Bloomberg, read everything she writes. she wrote an essay for All We Can Save, the first book that I co-edited, about this, that film actually showed us another way to live. If you've seen the film, the opening scene, you sort of fly in this aerial view over these like green rolling hills. There's herds of wild animals. It's super lush. And then bam, you're in the city. There's no suburbs in our envisioning of things in a Marvel universe. Like there's not a bunch of nasty cul-de-sacs where you have to like deal with gridlock, right? There's like vibranium powered maglev trains, and there's trolleys, and there's green buildings, and there's pedestrians, and it is sort of showing us this possible future. And so I feel like we need more of this sort of like show me it's worth it art and culture, and I'm just desperate for more pop stars, screenwriters, sculptors, muralists to just splash this everywhere.
Yeah, and I want to get back and talk more about that, but let's talk a bit more about that infrastructure, that imagined city that looks a little bit different. You write in your book that 75% of the infrastructure that will be in place in 2050 has yet to be built. So just think about that for a second. So much of
bonkers, right?
It's
like
crazy.
We're building the future now, but like not deliberately. It's just sort of like piddling along like we've always done.
But so this is a great opportunity for us. Like every
Huge.
single building we put up right now is going to be still here maybe in 50 or 100 years, and we can make a change now. How do you think about that, and how do we change that for this entire society that is thinking about how we build buildings for different reasons?
I mean, real answer is like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think thinking about 50 and 100 years is part of the problem. Like we're sitting here at Yale University. How old are these buildings? Like we should be thinking 500 years for a building, at least, right? Like we can't just keep building stuff unless we take sort of like a Lego block approach to building, which more and more cities are adopting these building codes for deconstruction. You have to take the buildings apart so that the pieces can be reused. More and more architects are designing to enable that, which is amazing, right? Like, why are we wasting I-beams? Like, we should be reusing those. And I come from a family of like iron workers, so I have a particular fondness for I-beams. But I think there's this big question of like, how do we even conceive of the future, and how far into the future can we actually get our heads around? Because a lot of the climate communication is trying to bring it closer and closer and closer because we don't value the future enough, right? Like in science communication, I have been very aggressively taught, do not talk about 2100. No one cares about the scientific projections out that far because they will likely not be alive, which is really an indictment of our lack of intergenerational care. So shout out to Third Act, who I know is in the room doing that beautiful work of the elder generation, helping to lead us forward. And so I think this whole question of timescale and like, can we actually care about something beyond 2035 and plan for it? Like, can we have more of this cathedral thinking?
I think one of the things that you've certainly talked about is the idea that people can get more engaged around this issue if they talk to their children, if they think about the future that their children will have. That feels obvious, right? If we can imagine that my child is going to live in a horrible hellscape or in a beautiful place, I would want them to live in a beautiful place. I think, though, that one thing that a lot of Americans do is they think about, well, what's good for my child? Like, what's good for my child? And a lot of what that means is, investing in a certain way, maybe living in a certain neighborhood, doing things so that my child has something. How do you talk to parents who are struggling with some of these things about, like, what kind of life do I want to leave for my parents, for my children? I mean,
I'm like,
yeah.
You're being selfish.
Yeah.
I mean, there are nicer ways to say that, but if all you care about is the future for your child, that's actually like, you're a terrible neighbor. You're not part of this community. And also, like, you can't actually secure a future just for your child because the climate crisis is coming for all of us, even if you have your bunker in New Zealand, right? There is no place to escape because we all need clean water and clean air and healthy food. And we can't produce actually all of those things as individual. I mean, it all comes down to this like horrible American individualism. And so when the statistic you were referring to was actually, it's specific to conservative parents. Conservative white men, or white men are most likely to be conservative and climate deniers. So that demographic, the people most likely to change their minds about climate change are their daughters. And so when you think about who's leading the youth climate movement, it's like something like 70% young women. And that is like one of the ways in which people start to shift, because, and it's messed up too, because like the reason that influence is there is because of our patriarchal structure, right? Like daddy's little girl, like want to keep everything safe for her, but I'll take it, right? Like if that's what motivates you to like want to be part of climate solutions, fine. But the other statistic that really pulls out the other side of this is when we think about individualism versus a more collective worldview, that's reflected in how different racial groups in America think about climate change. So, for example, it's about 40, it used to be 49%, it's now 47% of white Americans are concerned about climate. So that number is falling. It is, I think, 59% of Black Americans who are concerned and 70% of Latinx folks in America. So we have this because of like the false narratives in our media and culture that environmentalism is, you know, a white people thing, and all the images that we've seen for so long sort of highlighting this kind of like Patagonia fleece Prius driving, like looking into the distance. Now I'm on the board of Patagonia. It's an amazing company, but like we've been served this image, right? And as if that is like the environmentalist, and it's quantitatively untrue that that's the average environmentalist. And so it's one of these things where like across generations, across racial groups, across economic groups, it's not just, and people hear that stat on race and they're like, it's because people of color are more likely to be impacted by the effects of climate change, but it's actually not that reason. It's because people of color are more likely to have a collective worldview and feel like they should be part of the solution. And so, you know, welcome. It's a team sport here.
I think when we talked on stage back in 2019, I think your answer to the last question I had about what makes you hopeful is it was about empowering women. It was about the power of empowering women specifically that would help to move this effort at addressing climate change forward. And obviously, I would like to think that we've made some progress in the last 5 years toward that goal.
We would all like to think that. Do you have any data?
Fair enough.
Just feelings? I mean,
how do you feel we've done?
I mean, greenhouse gases are still rising, which is like the ultimate question data point, right? I think how do I feel about that? I mean, I think we were in this like very interesting cultural intersection, right? Sort of I have really oddly been at the epicenter of this, like the Me Too movement, pushing this new wave of gender equality, the climate crisis, people waking up to, Black Lives Matter, right? Okay. And then here I am, like a Black woman scientist, and everyone's like, Ayana, what do you think? And I've never gotten so much attention in my life. I mean, I've also like done a lot of things out in the world that would result in that. But it's so personally, I have a lot of opportunities and microphones, but I'm not sure if there's actually a shift in power, because when you go into those rooms and see who's controlling the money, if you look at Congress, If you look at who's running for president, like that hasn't changed really.
The thing that has happened, though, is what you talked about before, is that so many of the major climate movements have centered around young women. I mean, Greta Thunberg led a kind of a revolution that got millions of young women around the world activated and motivated. And it seems as though that has continued and has grown.
I think generationally, that's totally true. And when we but when we think about like the environmental movement in the US, we have to think about like all the big green organizations. They're the ones who actually like have the relationship with Congress. They're the ones who have tens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars of budgets, right? They're in many ways driving the policy agenda, right? The think tanks, etc. So I don't actually know the demographics in all those groups, or have they shifted. That there is a group called Green 2.0 that tracks this. That looks at how the demographics of the staff, leadership, and boards of environmental groups have changed over time or not. And there's one tidbit from reading their report a few years ago that stuck with me, which was like, okay, well, we see this discrepancy in who's represented, especially in positions of power in these organizations. How do we fix that? And there is this generational shift, right? Like if we wait long enough, the world will be run by women of color. But we don't have time. No, I'm kidding. We should all have an equal opportunity to shape the future, right? And we're not there yet. And so the question is, how do we get there? And there's one piece of advice that they gave, which I think is worth repeating. And it is so simple. And it is, when you are hiring, ask every candidate the same questions. Because I could go in, and I've had like a weird and lucky life where like, if you want to talk about skiing in Aspen, I got you. If you want to talk about architecture and furniture design and mid-century modern, blah, 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 I'm there. If you want to talk about Brooklyn and 90s hip hop, like I can rap with you on that. But that's not fair. Doesn't mean I'm more qualified for the job just because I'm better at making small talk about your hobbies. And so I think there's the whole like, oh, she's a better cultural fit is just like, you want to be friends with the person. They're not necessarily like a better policy analyst or whatever you're hiring for. So just to put that out there, I thought that was super useful.
It is super useful. You've got a chapter called Corporations Do Better in your book. We can't really expect them to do better on their own, though, can we? So what do we do to force the issue?
So this is a chapter I co-authored with Corley Kenna, who's the vice president of communications and policy at Patagonia. And it's a piece we actually wrote initially on the tails of Patagonia donating all of its shares to the planet 2 Septembers ago. And so now around $100 million a year in profits just gets donated to environmental groups. And we were trying to explain why that was the direction the company had chosen to go, right? Like they didn't decide to just sell the company and take all the money and donate it. They didn't decide to turn it over to be an employee-owned business. They decided to just give away the profits forever and prove the business model that you can actually do well and do good at the same time. And so we're sort of laying out these principles for what it would mean for a corporation to be a good citizen of the planet, including like being responsible for their scope 3 emissions of their whole carbon emissions of their whole supply chain. Thinking about lobbying for climate policy instead of against it. Most of the corporations that go to lobby on Capitol Hill are arguing against regulation, and like the good guys don't show up really in strength and advocate for things like the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we have this list of things, and then we wrote that list of 9 or 10 things corporations should do. And then I was like, okay, so we're going to need another list, which is like, what, since they're not just going to do it, what would government need to do to hold corporations accountable? And so then we wrote that list. And then I was like, so government's not really doing that. So then we wrote a list of like what citizens can do to hold government and corporations accountable. So it sort of got out of hand, but it's like a three listicle chapter there.
one of the what ifs you ask, and maybe this gets to it. This is a very big thing that probably, I don't know how we tackle in our lifetime, but it's a great question. What if nations focus on climate solutions, not economic growth?
Mm.
So that presupposes a lot of things about government, but really specifically about how corporations work. I mean, economic growth is, in the American lore, like the driver of why we have this wonderful country with all of these things. It's why we have the success that we have. But it is at odds with things like many of the climate solutions that you propose. So how do we do that? What do you think happens if we were to focus more on climate solutions and less on economic growth?
I mean, I posed all these questions in the book. I didn't answer them all. I opened each section with like these questions. Yes, as like, provocative. I think, what if we prize what over economic growth?
What if we focus on climate solutions, not economic growth?
I mean, it's sort of a false dichotomy, right? Because like at some point our economy will collapse if we don't focus on climate solutions. So there's that. But I think, like many people who care about the planet, it becomes obvious at some point that like endless extraction just doesn't make any sense. And so if we think about the economics 101 model of like natural resources in and like money out, right? Like that's like portrayed to us as a one-way train instead of a more circular economy. And so it's funny because when you were asking me this question that I rhetorically asked myself before, my first thought was a statistic I recently heard, which was the average American buys on average one new piece of clothing a week, or 52 over the course of a year. And I'm just like, what is wrong with us? When we think about growth, it's really about consumerism, right? It's really about the lifestyles we want and whether like, is any of that making us happy? Right? Like, I just think if I had like one more pair of, I don't know, high heels collecting dust in my closet, would that make me happier? No, I mean, I'm wearing like my godfather's jean jacket from the 70s and my mom's skirt from the 80s. And like, not all my clothing is this old or thrifted, but like, I love this stuff. And like carrying my people with me, literally on my back, like feels so good, So I wish that we would sort of collect things with meaning, not only because it's more sustainable, but because it's just like such a nicer way to live.
But people often, not everybody, but a lot of people don't want to give up their ability to get stuff. They want to be able to continue to consume. How do you?
Well, we've been taught this, right?
What? Yeah.
It's like what other sort of example do we need than the fact that people have like 10 different Stanley Cup reusable water bottles in colors to match their different like sweatsuits, right? Like this is bonkers. I think it's sort of like this depressing rat race of like collecting stuff and displaying stuff and like TikToking about the stuff that you have. And like, part of me is like, it's very sad, right? Because you look at the ways that people are grasping for relevance or meaning or to be liked, or to be liked, on all these ways. And it's just like, girl, go bake cookies with your friends, like go have a picnic outside, like go for a walk. Like, why are we doing this with our like one wild and precious life? The thought that anyone would need multiple reusable water bottles is just like beyond me. But yeah, that was definitely a tangent, but I feel like this is going to sound like really cute, but I think the part of the way that I think about how people can be useful in the climate movement, or it's really about this word, how can we be useful? Mm-hmm. Because when you have a purpose, when you're part of something bigger than yourself, everything else sort of falls into place and changes. And so I feel like the more underlying problem in American society, I mean, way over my head in this conversation, by the way, but we're just going with it, is that there's just like a lack of meaning, right? People don't have that sense of purpose. Like I think about my parents and grandparents. I mean, my father was an architect, my mom was an English teacher, and my grandfather was an iron worker, and my other grandfather ran a printing press, right? Like people who were like, I did a thing today. And so many of us don't have that because of the way modern society has evolved. And there's all like the sort of depression, anxiety, all of these things that especially young people are experiencing at such high rates. And the climate anxiety part of it too is like very, very real. And I just come back to, I was hearing the Surgeon General of the United States speak a few months ago with Krista Tippett on Being. And I remember just being kind of like annoyed, because basically his recommendation was, because of this mental health crisis, the answer is more spirituality and more talking about our feelings. And this will tell you a lot more about me than him, but I was just like, is talking about our feelings more really going to help us feel better, when the problem is that the world is falling apart around us and we're not contributing and we're just watching it melt and burn, right? And so if we are part of it, like, wouldn't that just feel better if you do your part and we don't have to worry so much about the outcome, but like you've chipped in, like you've found a way to be useful. And I just feel like we need more people sort of like guiding each other towards like, okay, what are you going to do? What am I going to do? What are we going to do together? What thing that already exists can we join? And then what can we add to that group? And that kind of additive, purposeful thing, even if it's not your paid job, even if it's your side hustle, your hobby.
You in some of your presentations and in this book, you present this kind of cool interlocking Venn diagram about how you get to what your climate action could be. And the three questions are: what brings you joy? What are you good at? And what work needs doing? And that center part is your climate action. I love that idea too. It's like, it's what am I good at? And I think that's the thing I think a lot of people don't think about. What can I bring to the table? That's such an important piece of that. How did you come up with that structure to allow us to think about what our climate action could be?
I think so. There's something called convergent evolution, which is like eyeballs evolved like 24 different times in the tree of life or whatever. And so this concept, I would not claim sole responsibility for. It's a Venn diagram. There's something similar in Japanese culture called ikigai. This is a 5-circle Venn diagram for finding your purpose that also includes like, how can you make money, and there's one other. But basically, as I was going around talking to people, I'm running into, of course, a lot of concerned people who are like, how can I help? What do I do? And I've always had such a hard time answering that question. And so has the environmental movement, because we usually are telling everyone to do the same thing, right? Like march, donate, protest, spread the word, lower your carbon footprint. And yes, you should be doing all of those things. But if we're all doing the same generic list of things to be useful, then we're leaving a lot on the table. Like we're leaving out our superpowers, right? Like a lawyer and a doctor and a teacher and a construction worker and a secretary and a filmmaker, like should all be using those skills towards climate solutions. So at first there's the generic list, and then there's the second answer, which is like, well, I don't know, what are you good at? And can you do that in some way? And then there's the like, well, what can you join and contribute, was like another way I was thinking about this. Because good Lord, everyone is starting their own nonprofit and their own thing and their own Instagram account and their own hashtag. And I'm just like, can we team up a little bit more? Like, can we get some M&A, mergers and acquisitions, in the environmental movement? And then I realized that this simple Venn diagram was kind of my sort of teacherly way of being like, well, here's a way to think about it. Go do your homework and fill it in, because I cannot answer that question for people, except for right now in 2024. I can say, like, we can all do everything we can to elect climate leaders up and down the ballot. Like, that is something we can all contribute to in whatever ways we can. So yeah, that's where that came from. I drew it on like a piece of cardboard in my house in 2020 with some Sharpies, when I was recording an episode of How to Save a Planet about this question of what can people do. And I was just like, this? Ask them what they're good at. And I think the part that gets left out, what skills do you have and what work needs doing is more obvious than thinking about what brings you joy. And I put that in there because I was seeing so many people kind of burn out. I mean, everyone was burning out for many, many reasons in 2020, but we need people to be doing climate work, implementing climate solutions for the rest of our lives. And so we can't do that if we're picking all these things that are just sort of like miserable, working with a bunch of jerks in a terrible place, And so I was thinking, how can we make this something that energizes and enlivens us instead of drains us too, as a really important filter.
You address people in my industry as part of the entire idea of culture that you explore in the book. You ask, what if journalists focus as much on solutions as problems? Mm-hmm. What could we do better?
Well, so every time we write a story about a flood or a wildfire or a hurricane, there are things we can do not to prevent those things, not to prevent extreme weather at this point. Like, we're getting the extreme weather. It's just a matter of how much more extreme it's going to get. It's a matter of like, how can we adapt to those changes? How can we be more resilient? How can we ensure that there's less loss of life? And there's a gazillion things we can do, right? There are ways that we can make cities absorb more water instead of just being concrete that leads to more flooding. There are ways that we can, bring back beavers to their native habitats so that those ecosystems can absorb more water and be more resistant to wildfire spreading. There's all these like super practical things we can do that we never hear about in those moments. Just like really bad flooding again, cars washing down the road, as if there's like no way forward, right? And every single story about the problem, I feel like should say like, this could have been less bad if this policy were passed, if this infrastructure existed, if we had a better warning system in place, if we funded our emergency management agencies, which are often, it's like the fire chief's side job is to also be the emergency manager in a lot of towns. We're just not problem solving this in a practical way. And I feel like journalists can do a lot to help us not just be freaked out by the problem, but think about solutions.
If I'm going to give a Science Friday plug for a second and tell you about a story we're working on for this Friday, which is really cool. I've been working on for a while with a reporter in Pittsburgh. And we got interested in the idea of what happened to all these cities that about 20, 25 years ago started passing their municipal climate goals. They said, we're going to do something about the climate in Pittsburgh, and it's going to be net zero by 2050 or whatever. So as journalists we were motivated by, so did they do a good job? Did they actually do this? The answer is it wasn't great, but sort of to the point of your book, it wasn't
we'll do it in 2049.
Well, it was, they're making incremental progress.
Yeah.
The thing that I think really impressed me as we met these people in Portland, Pittsburgh, Denver, and Baltimore was these are people with brand new jobs, essentially. They're like climate resilience czars or whatever in their community, and they bring such joy to the work. And there's this sort of sense that even if it's on a small scale, I'm like doing something good in my city. How much work have you, because you work with cities an awful lot, how much have you worked with people who are doing that hard work in individual communities trying to make, a difference in a global problem at a very small scale?
I mean, this is the work, right? Like, it's not glamorous. it's not like when people, I worry that the way that people perceive me because of some of the shiny press that I get, I'm like, I'm mostly writing emails like everybody else and going to meetings and trying to be organized and like build collaboration and like figure out like how we can push this politician to do this thing. How can we help, support this nonprofit that's pushing this thing? How could we like introduce these people that like really need to team up, right? Like that is the work. And I think at a city level, there's endless potential. And then cities actually do look to other cities for like, how are you solving this problem? So there's this ripple effect that can happen across cities. And that's the concept behind Urban Ocean Lab, which you alluded to, which is the nonprofit think tank that I co-founded a few years ago. And our work is policy to help coastal cities adapt to climate change. Coastal cities facing a different set of problems because of all that salt water, problems and opportunities. So I think we also started it, during the Trump administration, thinking about how impossible it is to get anything through Congress, and that city governments often can and want to make change much more quickly. And so we could help on the city government level. And I'll tell you all, this goes live. It's secretly already live on the website, but we're going to be officially launching this coming week a resource hub on the urbanoceanlab.org website that has hundreds of vetted resources for communities and local governments to make better decisions about how they're adapting to climate change. Everything from fact sheets to data sets to policy memos to legislative templates to scientific papers that are all related to how do we deal with sea level rise? How do we protect and restore coastal ecosystems? How do we make communities more resilient? Because a lot of places are reinventing the wheel. And so we wanted to collect all this like really high quality information in one place, have it be open access so people would be able to, bring this information to their elected officials, or like, policymakers in these city offices often don't have time to do all this research. They don't have the data. So we were like, well, let's just gather as much of it as we can and like put it at urbanoceanlab.org/resource-hub. So yeah, you can go there and like flip through and see if there's anything you want to get New Haven to do for you.
That's solving a huge problem for a lot of these folks. What they told us was, we're spending so much time trying to collect data, we're not able to respond to the data as we find it. So we're behind the curve on making changes because we're not collecting data. We're also not counting the same things in every city. Mm-hmm. So because we're not counting the same data, it's hard to actually know where we stand compared to our counterparts. So just providing that seems like it could be very helpful to cities like New Haven and the four that I mentioned. That's interesting. I want, in just a couple of minutes, we're going to get to some questions from the audience. I want to bring up somebody else that you talked to in the book, someone I've actually talked to on one of these stages here at the festival. He's from just down the road here, Bren Smith. He does regenerative ocean farming. It's one of his solutions. Could you just talk about this idea as a real industry that can be something that is happening right now, not just some climate future for off to 2100?
So Bren Smith is the co-founder of a nonprofit called Green Wave. I'm on the board because I am such a big fan. And it is about training a generation of ocean farmers who are growing seaweed, oysters, mussels, clams, scallops. This idea of you have like a 3 dimensions of sort of farmland in the ocean, and you can grow so much food in a small sort of surface area because you have this depth. And so they've been training farmers and helping to build the market for the product, making sure that they have someone to sell their seaweed to, making sure farmers are paid in advance for their crops often, helping them with crop insurance, and advocating for policy change. Urban Ocean Lab has collaborated with them on a policy memo for what it would look like to responsibly advance regenerative ocean farming in the United States. It's one of these fields that, since it's it's brand new on an industrial scale. There's not really policy that exists to manage it. So it's not like it's banned, but there's also no way to get a permit in a lot of places. And USDA needs to get on board with supporting this as a food source. There's all these, these ways in which you could have this revitalize coastal economies that were so dependent on fish stocks that have been overfished and plummeted, and the fish stocks that are also like moving north because of climate change, right? Long Island Sound used to be full of lobsters, and now they're moving from Maine to Canada. So in this dynamic shifting world, it's a great opportunity to think about an extremely sustainable local food source with good jobs in the community, revitalizing the working waterfront, absorbing carbon. I mean, the protein from seaweed and oysters is like a lower carbon footprint than being vegan by some calculations, right? It's just like that efficient because they're all filter feeders. You don't need any fresh water. You don't need any land. You don't need any fertilizer, no pesticides, just like the ocean is magic. I clearly have like a bias towards the ocean. So yeah, that's Bren Smith, and he is the last interview in the book of 20 interviews from like lawyers and nonprofit executives and youth climate activists and architects and museum directors and filmmakers and indigenous strategists and foresters, farmers, just the most amazing group of people who have helped me answer this question of what if we get it right. But Bren is the last because for all those other things, we have so much bad stuff to undo. We think about agriculture in America. Like, we've got a lot to undo. My next lifetime, I'm taking on the Farm Bill. But for ocean farming, we haven't really gotten it wrong yet. Like, it hasn't become this like corporate oligopoly that's like wielding all of this chamber of commerce power and paying poverty wages and polluting with impunity. Like that system isn't there yet. So we could actually get it right from the start, which is why I wanted to interview him, because it's such a chance to dream about, like, what is the future for coastal communities instead of what he's seeing. He's like, for, there's just a lot more maritime museums where there used to be marinas. And so what would it look like to actually move people out of harm's way in terms of adapting to sea level rise, but revitalize coastal communities through these new industries, or like offshore renewable energy in partnership with that as well?
There's a bunch more stuff that I would love to ask about, but we have a couple of microphones. Where are our microphones here? They're in the back. If you could raise your hand, we're going to try to get to a couple of questions here. So come find some folks with raised hands and give them microphones. I just want to ask you quickly, you also, as you said, you talk with indigenous thinkers, including about indigenous farming practices. And one of the ideas, the concepts that you write about in the book that I think is so important is this idea of being in right relationship with the land. What does that mean to you?
I know, it seems sort of obvious, I guess. Like, so many of these things, it's like, why does justice matter? These questions I get, I'm like, it just does. It's like, that's by definition. So this is a hard one to answer, but it's just, it's like that harmonious relationship with other living things.
Everyone has a different, I guess it's interesting to me because everyone does have a different relationship with land. Not everyone's relationship is exactly the same, and some people's relationship is extractive. Some people's relationship with the land
I would not call that right relationship, personally. Yeah.
What questions do we have? Where's the microphone? There it is. Hi, what's your name?
One. Hi, my name is Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
And great talk, by the way. So I have a what if question for you. Because, we all hear about massive protests outside of big banks, and
I wish they were massive. They're not.
Well, okay, right. But protests outside of big banks. I wonder what would happen if we stopped protesting and instead just switched banks to banks who are part of the Fossil Free Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
I just switched to Walden Mutual, and they invest in regenerative agriculture.
I love this question. I think we will always need protest, right? so I have nothing bad to say about protesting banks that are in the U.S. It is J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citibank. Thank you, third act. They are the big four baddies. They are funding the vast majority of fossil fuel expansion, like hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And so if you have your money in any of those four banks, I hate to break it to you, but you are part of the problem, and your money is funding not just existing fossil fuel stuff, but expanding extraction. And so, yes, fossil free. What is the web? Do you know the website?
It is. So if you go to bank.green, and then it's the Fossil Free Alliance.
Fossil Free Alliance. There's a bunch of different places that are collecting this information about alternative places to bank. I moved my money a few years ago, and I just feel you just have to do it once and then you're done, and it's great. But I think the sort of the fact of the matter is the analysis has shown that if you have, which many people, in their middle age do, like $125,000 saved up or more for your retirement, that money in the bank could be doing more damage than any amount of like vegan bicycle riding lifestyle that you have, because you are contributing to the problem through your dollars. And so I think so often we don't have a good sense of scale, right? Of like what has the biggest impact. And it's not that we have to choose. We can think about our diets and our transportation as well as where our money is. But when we think about what's most important, we should absolutely be thinking about where we're banking. Where is your 401k? Where's your Roth IRA? Does your employer have even climate-friendly options? Can you push your employer to make those available to everyone in the place where you work?
But it's important to note, though, and you say this in the book, though, this type of environmentally friendly investing is actually doing better now than some of the fossil fuel investing that we all did throughout the course of the last half a century. That's really important to note because people also want to be able to retire comfortably, right? I mean,
yeah.
So we can also report that's working too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be responsible for anybody's financial decisions, but
a disclosure at the bottom.
But I use Betterment for managing my money, and it seems their climate fund, which actually was created because if you are friends with me and you don't work on climate, I will force you into the center of your climate action Venn diagram, which happened with my friend Boris, who came with me because he was bored to one of Jane Fonda's climate actions in DC, which was all about divestment. And he heard her talk, and he heard Bill McKibben talk, and he heard all these celebrities talk about why it's important. He was like, divestment, but what? But then what? What do we invest in after we divest from the bad stuff? What's the good option? And I was like, you're literally senior vice president at a financial tech company. Maybe you could figure that out. And 9 months later, he launched the climate fund at Betterment. And I was like, okay, you can have my money.
I think that's just about all the time that we have. And I really want to thank you, Dr. Johnson, for all of this time and for all these wonderful ideas and for inspiring us as well, because as we said at the start, this can be somewhat gloomy, but I was impressed with all the rhetorical questions, and it gave me a lot to think about reading through your book. So I'm looking forward to seeing it out in the world in September. Thanks again for your time, and thank you for all the great questions.